The desert town of Red Rock, Arizona, had a way of swallowing sound. The dry wind scoured through the cottonwoods, rattling loose tin signs above shuttered storefronts, and then moved on without pause, carrying away laughter, rumors, and cries for help with equal indifference. Out here, silence wasn't always peace, it was survival. People kept to themselves. But silence broke one dusty afternoon in the most unlikely place, the public library. It was Martha O'Connor who found it. Martha had been the town librarian for nearly 30 years. Her hair was silver, cut short like the no-nonsense schoolteacher she once had been, and her sharp eyes rarely missed much. She knew the rhythms of the children who trickled in after school, some coming for story time, others just for the blessed air conditioning in July. She knew who colored outside the lines, who whispered too loud in the stacks, who quietly tucked away their worries in borrowed books. So when she noticed a single sheet of paper left behind on the corner table, creased, smudged, forgotten, it tugged at her instincts. She lifted it carefully, expecting a scribble or a half-finished math assignment. But what she saw made her throat tighten. The drawing was crude, shaky, drawn with the unsteady grip of a child. There was a rectangle, shaded dark, with slats like a cage. Inside, a stick figure curled in a corner. Beside it, another figure stood tall, labeled with one simple word, Dad. And in a child's uneven handwriting, scrawled at the bottom of the page, Dad, please find me. Martha's chest constricted. She sat down heavily, the paper trembling in her hands. She had seen enough troubled kids in her teaching days to recognize desperation written between the lines. Her first thought was Ethan. Ethan Hayes, 7 years old, bright but shy, who used to come to the library with his father until suddenly he stopped. The boy's aunt, Brenda Vaughn, had started bringing him around instead, always with a tight grip and a curt voice. Something about it had never sat right with Martha. And then there was Ethan's father, Officer Daniel Hayes. Daniel wasn't the type to wear his heart on his sleeve. 38, tall, broad-shouldered, with that steady way of walking that came from years on the force and years more trying to balance the badge with fatherhood. He carried the quiet weariness of a man who had learned that justice on paper wasn't always the same as justice in life. The courthouse had ruled in Brenda's favor months ago, handing her temporary custody while Daniel's long shifts kept him away. But Martha remembered the way Ethan's eyes used to light up when Ranger trotted at his side. Ranger, that German shepherd, with the proud stance and sable coat, streaked black and tan. Once a K-9 officer, injured and reassigned, now serving as emotional anchor for both father and son. Ranger was more than a dog. He was a presence, a comfort, a silent oath that no harm would slip past his watch. Martha stared at the page again, the words burning against her conscience. She knew what she had to do. Daniel was finishing paperwork at the station when the call came through. Martha's voice quavered on the other end. Danny, she said, using the nickname she'd only ever used when he was a boy himself, coming into her library. You need to see this, right away. 10 minutes later, Daniel pulled up outside the library in his patrol SUV. Ranger sat alert in the passenger seat, ears perked, nose twitching as if he already sensed something was wrong. Inside, Martha slid the drawing across the counter. Daniel looked down at it, his jaw tightening as though it had been wired shut. It wasn't the crude lines that shattered him, it was the handwriting. He recognized every uneven stroke. Ethan had once practiced letters at the kitchen table, tongue poking out, determined to make his ease match his father's neat block script. Now those same letters were screaming from the page. Dad, please find me. Ranger let out a sharp bark, startling Martha. The dog's hackles rose as he pressed against Daniel's leg, picking up on his human's sudden storm of emotion. Daniel forced himself to breathe in even counts, the way training demanded. Inhale, 4 beats. Exhale, 4 beats. But the father in him wanted to storm out the door, badge be damned, and tear down every locked door until he held his son again. He swallowed hard, fingers curling against the page. Where did you find this? Left on the children's table, Martha said softly. It was Ethan, Danny, I know it. For a moment, Daniel's carefully built walls of composure cracked. He saw flashes the last hug at the courthouse, Ethan's whisper, I'll be brave, Dad. The look in his son's eyes when Brenda pulled him away. The cold silence of an empty house when Ranger waited by the door. The badge on his chest suddenly felt like a weight pulling him under. Was he a cop first, or a father? He looked at Ranger, whose deep brown eyes held no doubt. Ranger pressed closer, a living reminder that some oaths were stronger than court orders. Daniel straightened, slipping the drawing into an evidence sleeve. This is enough to start asking questions. I'll log it. But if he's in trouble... His voice broke for just a fraction of a second. If he's in trouble, I'm not waiting on paperwork. Martha touched his arm, her expression fierce. "Don't you dare let them silence that boy again." Daniel nodded once. That evening, the sun sank over the mesas, bleeding copper light across the desert floor. Daniel parked his SUV outside his small rental house, Ranger shifting anxiously in the seat beside him. He held the evidence sleeve against the dashboard, the last rays of sun catching on the child's desperate words. His son was out there somewhere close, maybe just a mile or two away, crying out in pencil and paper because no one else was listening. The radio crackled to life. Dispatcher Kelly Monroe's voice filled the cab, steady and practiced, but with an undertone that Daniel had learned to recognize as concern. "Unit 12, we've got a report. Third-hand tip, but consistent chatter. Juvenile possibly being kept in an animal enclosure near the Vaughn property. No visual confirmation." Caller hung up. Daniel's pulse thundered in his ears. Vaughn! Brenda Vaughn! The father in him surged forward, raw and unrestrained. The officer in him fought to keep the wheel steady. "Copy," he said into the mic, his voice controlled, professional. But his grip on the steering wheel whitened his knuckles. Ranger whined low, restless, ears swiveling. "Notify sheriff's deputies and CPS," Daniel added, though his thoughts had already raced ahead. "Animal enclosure. Juvenile. My boy." "Already in motion," Kelly replied. "You're closest, Danny, but don't go charging in alone." Daniel's gaze shifted to the evidence sleeve, to the words that had burned through the silence of Red Rock. "Dad, please find me." His jaw set. He reached over, resting his hand on Ranger's back. The shepherd's muscles were taut, ready, a mirror of his own resolve. "We're going," Daniel whispered. He started the engine. The SUV rumbled to life, headlights cutting through the encroaching dark. The road south of Red Rock narrowed to gravel, flanked by barbed wire and creosote bushes. Daniel's SUV moved at a measured speed, tires crunching against the dry earth, but his grip on the wheel betrayed urgency. The desert air pressed thick, copper twilight bleeding into the first stretch of night. Beside him, Ranger bristled ears tall, nostrils flaring as he sniffed the wind. His low growl vibrated against the stillness of the cab, a sound Daniel knew well, the signal of something close. "Easy," Daniel murmured, though his own chest was tight. He leaned forward, scanning the dark horizon. For a split second, he swore he'd heard a muffled cry. Was it Ethan's voice carried on the wind, or just the desert playing cruel tricks? He didn't have the luxury of doubt. The Vaughn property came into view, a scatter of dilapidated sheds, a clapboard house with peeling white paint, and fields gone to weeds. The place looked weary, sagging under years of neglect. A lone porch bulb flickered like it was fighting for life. Daniel cut the headlights and parked 100 yards out. Training whispered caution. Observe before approaching. Fatherhood screamed, "Go now." He forced his breathing into rhythm, steadying himself between badge and blood. "Stay close," he whispered to Ranger, unclipping the harness. The shepherd stepped out in silence, his paws crunching gravel like soft percussion. As Daniel advanced, voices carried through the still air. A woman's sharp tone, angry, high-pitched. Beneath it, faint sobs. Brenda and Ethan. Daniel crouched near the corner of a shed, peering toward the back of the property. His stomach clenched. There it was, the hog pen. A crude structure of wire fencing, sagging tarp pulled across the top, straw spilling onto the dirt. Inside, a small shadow shifted. A child's sobs trembled against the night. Daniel's heart lurched. "Ethan." He pulled his radio from his belt. "Dispatch, Unit 12. Juvenile in distress at Vaughn property. Possible unlawful confinement. Request immediate backup, sheriff's deputies, and CPS on standby." Kelly Monroe's voice answered almost instantly. "Copy, Unit 12. Deputies en route. Hold position until backup arrives." Daniel's jaw locked. Hold position. Wait. The words grated against every nerve in his body. His son was right there, crying in the dark, bound by rope and neglect. Ranger shifted at his side, tail stiff, hackles raised. His nose pointed directly at the tarp. He could smell Ethan. He could smell fear. Brenda's voice cut sharper now. "Stop that crying, boy. You think anyone's coming for you? Nobody's coming. Not your daddy, not your mutt. You're mine now." Ethan's muffled reply broke like glass. "Dad will find me," he promised. Daniel's breath caught, the sound piercing him deeper than any blade. His son's faith had survived where the system failed. Ethan still believed, and Daniel could not let that faith shatter. He rose from cover. Training said wait for backup. Fatherhood said now. Exigent circumstances, he muttered under his breath, words from a law book that gave him permission to act when life or safety was at stake. He no longer needed permission. He already had it in Ethan's plea. Knife in hand, He approached the pen. Ranger padded low beside him, silent, steady, every muscle coiled. The tarp sagged in his grip as he cut through it with one swift motion. The flashlight beam cut into the darkness. "Ethan!" The boy jerked up, eyes wide, face streaked with dirt and tears, his wrists bound with rough rope. He blinked, disbelief flashing before recognition broke through. "Dad?" The single word shredded Daniel's composure. He dropped to his knees, slicing the rope away with practiced precision, pulling Ethan into his arms. The boy's small body clung fiercely, shaking, but alive. "It's okay, son. Dad's here. You're safe." For the first time in months, the word "dad" felt like salvation instead of longing. Behind him, footsteps. A shadow loomed. Brenda Vaughn's voice cracked the night. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Daniel turned, shielding Ethan instinctively. Brenda stood a few yards away, hands balled into fists, her frame tall but brittle, eyes wild with fury. "He's exaggerating," she snapped. "That boy needs discipline, that's all. You can't just take him." "Step back, Brenda." Daniel's voice was iron. "Backup's on the way. Don't make this worse." Brenda advanced a step, spitting words. "He's my responsibility. You don't get to swoop in after months and play the hero." Ranger growled low, teeth flashing just enough to halt her next step. His body stood like a drawn boundary between danger and safety. Daniel held Ethan tighter. "You lost the right to call yourself responsible when you put him in a hog pen." The sound of sirens split the tension. Sheriff's deputies approached, red and blue lights cutting through the night, bouncing off the clapboard walls. Deputy Carlos Ortega was first on scene. He was stocky, dark-haired, calm-eyed, a man who had grown up in Red Rock and carried its dust in his bones. He took in the scene quickly. Daniel, clutching his son, rope cut loose on the ground. Brenda's face twisted with fury. Ranger standing guard. "Understood," Ortega said, voice firm. "We'll take it from here." Brenda shouted, lunging again. Ranger barked, sharp and commanding, forcing her to freeze. Ortega moved in, reciting rites, guiding her away. Daniel stood back, Ethan's arms around his neck, the boy whispering again and again, "Dad, Dad, Dad," as though saying it enough times might make the nightmare disappear. For Daniel, the world had narrowed to this moment. His son alive in his arms, Ranger at his side, backup securing the scene. Relief crashed over him in waves, yet unease lingered. The law was only just beginning its work. Ortega glanced at him, understanding flickering in his steady eyes. "Get him to the clinic, Danny. Let Dr. Bennett take a look. We'll handle the rest here." Daniel nodded, moving toward the SUV. Ethan clung tighter, his small fingers gripping Daniel's shirt like lifelines. Ranger trotted beside them, ears swiveling, nose high. As Daniel settled Ethan gently into the back seat, the boy whispered, hoarse but certain, "I told her you'd come. I told her Ranger wouldn't forget me." Daniel swallowed hard, brushing the boy's hair back. "And you were right, son. You were right." The Desert Inn motel lights faded in the rear view as Daniel drove through the night toward the clinic. Ethan lay curled in the back seat, eyes half closed, clutching the smooth white stone. Ranger sat forward, watchful, his reflection flickering in the glass as the SUV's headlights cut across the road. The town of Red Rock never looked smaller than it did at night. The streets were nearly empty, storefronts shuttered, neon buzzing faintly over the diner. The sheriff's substation glowed steady on one corner, while the adobe walls of the community clinic waited ahead like a promise of relief. Inside the cab, silence hummed louder than the tires. Ethan hadn't spoken since he mentioned the stone. His small knuckles were white, gripping it as if it were the last tether to safety. Daniel stole glances in the mirror, his chest tightening at every flicker of fear in his son's eyes. "We're almost there, buddy," Daniel said softly. "Dr. Bennett will take care of you." Ethan didn't answer, but his grip on the stone tightened. Ranger gave a low rumble in his throat, not aggressive, more like reassurance, the sound of a sentinel reminding them both he was here. The clinic was a modest adobe structure, with turquoise trim faded by decades of Sunday. A single porch light glowed above the entrance, casting a circle of amber on cracked concrete steps. Daniel carried Ethan inside, Ranger pacing close but halting at the door, until Daniel gave a hand signal. The reception was empty except for Mary Ellen Cross, a volunteer nurse with round glasses and a warm but brisk manner. She looked up, her face shifting instantly from routine fatigue to concern. "Go on back, Officer Hayes," she said, standing. "Dr. Bennett's expecting you." Dr. Laura Bennett emerged moments later, tall and spare in her navy scrubs and white coat. Her auburn hair was tied back with silver streaks near her temples. Years of desert sun and harder truths had etched lines at her eyes, but her expression carried steadiness like bedrock. She didn't waste words. "Bring him in." The exam room smelled of antiseptic cut with the faint herbal note of eucalyptus. Daniel set Ethan gently on the padded table. The boy flinched at the bright fluorescent light overhead. Bennett noticed instantly. "Too bright, isn't it?" she murmured. Without hesitation, she dimmed the overheads and clicked on a shaded lamp. The amber glow spilled across the room, softer, warmer, turning the sterile space into something more private. The change was immediate. Ethan exhaled a small sigh, his shoulders loosening fractionally. Daniel squeezed his hand, silently grateful. "Let's take a look, Ethan," Bennett said, her voice calm but precise. She examined the boy's wrists, red, swollen, rope marks biting deep. Bruises mottled his arms and shins, old ones fading yellow, fresh ones darkening blue. A shallow scratch crossed his temple. She recorded each carefully, dictating notes in clipped phrases. Multiple contusions, resolving bruises 5 to 10 days, rope abrasions at both wrists, superficial lacerations, likely wire or straw exposure. No acute fractures. Photographic documentation recommended for CPS file. Daniel stood beside the table, jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. Every mark felt like a personal failure, proof that the system had handed his boy to danger while he'd been forced to wait on paperwork. Ethan's small hand clutched the white stone through it all. Bennett's eyes flicked to it. "What's that you've got there?" she asked gently. Ethan's voice was barely audible. "It keeps me from shaking." Bennett nodded, as though he'd just offered a profound medical truth. "Then you hold on to it, okay? Doctors need brave patients, and brave patients need their tools." Daniel's throat tightened. He covered Ethan's hand with his own, whispering counts. "Inhale 1, 2, 3, 4. Exhale 1, 2, 3, 4. The same breathing he'd practiced on patrol, now handed to his son like a lifeline. Slowly, Ethan's trembling eased. Ranger scratched once at the door, ears visible through the glass. Bennett glanced at Daniel. "Would it help if he came in?" Daniel nodded. The shepherd trotted inside, settling instantly at the foot of the table. Ethan dropped his hand, Ranger nudged it with his nose, and the boy's grip loosened. For the first time that night, his breathing steadied without effort. When the exam ended, Bennett stepped aside with Daniel. "He's safe for tonight," she said firmly. "CPS will need the documentation, but he'll need ongoing support counseling, maybe long-term supervision." Daniel's eyes darkened. "I'll give him whatever it takes." Bennett studied him for a beat. "The stone? Did Brenda give that to him?" Daniel shook his head. "No. Ethan said she told him if he ever lost it, he'd never see me again." Something unreadable flickered in Bennett's gaze. "That's a cruel kind of tether for a child. Keep it safe for now, but be ready. Objects like that can cut both ways. They can anchor healing, or they can trap fear." Daniel exhaled slowly, glancing at the stone. It looked so ordinary, yet in his son's palm, it carried the weight of chains. Hours later, they left the clinic. The desert night had cooled slightly, the air sharp with sage. Ethan leaned against Daniel's shoulder, half asleep, Ranger pacing faithfully at their side. For the first time in weeks, Daniel felt the stirrings of safety, thin and fragile but real. At the SUV, Ethan clutched his father's shirt. "Dad, will she come back for me?" Daniel crouched to meet his eyes. "No one's taking you from me again. That's a promise." Ethan's small nod was slow but certain. He tucked the stone back into his pocket and rested his head against Ranger's flank once they settled inside the car. The shepherd shifted slightly, protective, eyes scanning the shadows. The sandstone courthouse of Red Rock was a building that had always seemed too large for the town, with its columns cracked by desert sun and its faded American flag lifting lazily in the dry wind. On this morning, though, it looked far too small for the weight of what it was about to hold. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of floor polish and dust. Families whispered along the benches, their voices carrying nervous energy. At the far end of the corridor stood Judge Helen Whitaker's courtroom, the door propped open, a deputy stationed outside. Daniel Hayes walked in carrying his son's small backpack and the heavier weight of every sleepless night since the rescue. Ethan clung to his father's hand, eyes wide, the white stone hidden in his pocket like a secret talisman. Ranger remained outside under a deputy's care, but Daniel could feel his absence like a missing heartbeat. The courtroom itself was simple. Wooden benches scuffed from decades of use, flags in the corners, a raised bench at the front where Judge Whitaker presided. She was a tall woman in her 60s with piercing blue eyes and a jawline carved by years of rulings that weighed lives in their balance. She carried herself with quiet authority, the kind that didn't need volume to command silence. To the left sat Prosecutor James Ward, sandy-haired, efficient, with his files stacked in precise order. Across from him, defense attorney Mark Klein, slick in a charcoal suit, leaned toward his client Brenda Vaughn. She looked smaller in her wrinkled blouse, but her gaze was still sharp, brittle defiance clinging to her like armor. At a side table, Monica Ruiz from CPS tapped at her laptop, folders neatly aligned. Beside her, Martha O'Connor sat with hands folded tightly in her lap, cat-eye glasses glinting under the fluorescent lights. The atmosphere was taut, a cord pulled tight. Judge Whitaker struck her gavel once. This is a preliminary custody hearing regarding the minor, Ethan Hayes. The court will hear testimony and review evidence to determine temporary guardianship, pending further proceedings. Ward rose first. Your Honor, the state submits evidence collected at the Vaughn property, including photographic documentation of confinement conditions, medical reports by Dr. Laura Bennett, and audio testimony from neighbor Martha O'Connor. He gestured to the bailiff, who placed photos on the bench. Rope burns around small wrists, the crude hog pen, vouchers stuffed behind a stove panel. The room seemed to shrink around those images. Klein leapt up. Objection. These photos prejudice the court without full context. Children scrape themselves all the time. Discipline does not equal abuse. Whitaker's gaze froze him mid-sentence. Mr. Klein, sit down. The court will determine the weight of the evidence. Klein sank back, his jaw tight. Martha was called forward first. She stood at the witness stand, small but steady. I heard shouting from the Vaughn farm many nights, she said clearly. Not the kind of shouting you ignore. One night I turned on my phone recorder from the road, and it caught her voice, Brenda's voice, and the boy crying. Ward played the brief audio. Harsh words carried on the wind, a child sobbing, then silence. It wasn't long, but it was enough to shift the air in the room. Klein objected again. Hearsay. A neighbor's nosy concern doesn't prove unlawful conduct. Whitaker leaned forward. It will be admitted under conditional relevance. The court finds that what is plainly audible from a public vantage point does not constitute invasion of privacy. Martha returned to her seat, her spine straight despite the tremor in her hands. Next, Monica Ruiz summarized the CPS file. 3 prior reports were redlined due to insufficient evidence. Teachers noted bruises. A neighbor reported crying. But without documentation, the cases were closed. Now, with Dr. Bennett's report and law enforcement photographs, we have corroboration. She glanced at Ethan, her expression softening. This child deserves protection that cannot be delayed again. Ward nodded. The state requests immediate temporary custody to the father, Officer Daniel Hayes, and a no-contact order against the respondent. Klein rose sharply. Your Honor, let us not forget Officer Hayes is a law enforcement officer. His hours are irregular. He cannot provide consistent care. Brenda, though strict, has provided shelter. The court should not reward a parent who prioritizes his badge over his child. Daniel felt heat crawl up his neck. He stood slowly, steadying his voice. Your Honor, I've worn this badge for over a decade. It's taught me patience, discipline, and sacrifice. But nothing, not one thing, means more to me than my son. I will make the schedule work. I will stand between him and harm, no matter what it takes. The courtroom was silent, except for the scrape of the judge's pen against her notes. Then came the hardest moment. Ethan was called forward. Daniel wanted to shield him, but Whitaker insisted gently. Sometimes the smallest voices tell the greatest truths. Ethan walked to the stand, stone clutched tight in his fist. He climbed the chair, his legs dangling. His eyes flicked to Daniel, who gave him a small nod. Ranger wasn't here to nudge his elbow, but Ethan's lips moved as though whispering to him anyway. The bailiff swore him in with patient words. Ethan nodded, then whispered, Yes. Ward approached softly. Ethan, do you know why you're here today? The boy's voice was shaky but clear. Because I don't want to go back there. Ward nodded. And where is there? Brenda's farm, the pen, the ropes. Gasps stirred through the gallery. Ward kept his voice steady. Who do you want to live with, Ethan? The boy lifted his stone, knuckles pale, and whispered, My dad, and Ranger. For Daniel, the words landed like both a wound and a balm. His throat constricted, but pride steadied him. Judge Whitaker's gaze softened for a heartbeat, then hardened again. She raised her gavel. The court finds that the respondent, Brenda Vaughn, poses a risk to the minor. Temporary custody is awarded to the father, Daniel Hayes. A no-contact order is issued effective immediately. This matter is referred to the district attorney's office for criminal review. A status hearing will be scheduled in 30 days. The gavel struck, one sharp echo that seemed to shake the walls. Brenda erupted. This is a mistake. He'll see what happens when he plays hero. Deputies moved quickly, guiding her out, her voice cracking against the wooden walls. Ethan pressed into his father's side, whispering over and over, "Dad, Dad, Dad," as though each repetition anchored him more firmly in safety. Daniel crouched, wrapping an arm around his son. "You're safe. We're going home." The desert sunlight outside the courthouse was blinding, reflecting off the pale stone steps as Daniel guided Ethan down, his arm firmly around his son's shoulders. The courthouse doors clattered shut behind them, sealing away Brenda's fury for now. But relief was short-lived. Across the street, in the shade of a battered Ford pickup, a lanky teenage boy lingered. His jeans were frayed, his t-shirt faded, his posture uncertain. Jason Vaughn, Brenda's eldest. His eyes were pale, washed out like the desert sky after too much heat. They flicked nervously from Daniel to Ethan, then down at his scuffed sneakers. Ethan gripped Daniel's hand tighter, his small knuckles white. "Dad," he whispered, "why's Jason staring at us?" Daniel's jaw tightened. He knew enough about cycles of harm to recognize the possibility. Sometimes children imitated cruelty, sometimes they fled from it. Jason could be either. He crouched slightly, placing a steadying hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Stay close, buddy. Let me handle this." Jason stepped forward, his movements hesitant, as if testing whether the ground beneath him would hold. The deputies stationed near the entrance shifted subtly, hands brushing their holsters, reading the tension. Daniel straightened, his badge and his fatherhood equally present in his stance. "Jason," he said evenly, "you got something to say?" The boy's throat worked, his voice cracked from disuse. I didn't know it was that bad." With Ethan, Daniel studied him, cautious. "Didn't know or didn't want to see?" Jason flinched. His gaze darted to the courthouse doors where his mother had been taken away. She made us stay quiet, said if I talked, they'd take me too, said no one would believe me." Ethan pressed closer against Daniel's side, eyes wide but searching Jason's face. "Dad," he whispered, he didn't tie me up. It was her." Daniel kept his eyes on Jason. "Why are you here now?" The teenager's shoulders sagged. "Because I heard what the judge said. And I don't got anywhere else to go." The words hung in the air, heavier than the heat. Daniel exhaled slowly. He knew what abandonment smelled like. He'd seen it in too many cases. Too many young faces left to drift when adults failed them. Jason was 15, maybe 16, old enough to fight, young enough to still be lost. But trust was not given lightly, not when Ethan's safety was the center of everything. "Jason," Daniel said carefully, "if you want me to believe you, you're gonna have to show me. Words won't cut it." Jason nodded quickly, desperate. I got a notebook. Been writing stuff down. Times, dates, what she did, what she said. It's back at the house. I mean, the place she left me after they arrested her." Daniel's stomach tightened. Evidence? Or a trap? That night, back at the motel, Ethan curled on the bed with Ranger stretched protectively across the foot. The boy's hand clutched the white stone even in sleep, his breath uneven but steady. Daniel sat at the table, Jason across from him. Between them, a plastic grocery sack sat on the wood. Inside, a battered spiral notebook. Jason's fingers trembled as he pushed it forward. "I started writing months ago. Couldn't tell nobody, so I wrote it down instead." Daniel flipped it open. The pages were messy, ink smeared in spots, but the entries were raw. Dates scrawled in the corners. Notes about Ethan being locked out of the house, about Brenda taking vouchers and selling them for cash, about punishments that went too far. One page bore a crude sketch of the hog pen. Daniel's jaw tightened. This wasn't just a boy looking for pity. It was testimony, maybe the kind of record CPS had needed months ago. He looked up. "Why give this to me now?" Jason swallowed hard. "Because you listen, and you look like the kind of man who doesn't walk away." For a long beat, silence stretched between them. Daniel could feel the weight of responsibility shifting. One boy safe in the bed behind him. Another sitting across the table, teetering between redemption and ruin. The motel air conditioner rattled as Ranger suddenly lifted his head, ears pricked, body tense. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Daniel's hand moved instinctively to the grip of his holstered sidearm. "Stay here," he ordered Jason quietly, rising. He crossed to the window, peering through the blinds. Headlights flashed once across the gravel lot, then cut out. An engine idled in the dark. The hair on Daniel's neck rose. He knew that rhythm, the too long pause, the shadow of someone watching. Jason's voice was tight. "She's got people. My mom. She said if anyone crossed her, she had friends who'd make sure they regretted it." Daniel's pulse hammered. Was this just paranoia, or had Brenda already set something in motion from her cell? The knock rattled the motel door again, 3 sharp raps that cut through the hum of the old air conditioner. Ranger stiffened, body low, hackles bristling, a growl pulsing from deep in his chest. Daniel's hand hovered above his holster. Ethan stirred on the bed, clutching the white stone tighter even in half sleep. Jason froze at the table, his wide eyes darting toward the door. Another knock, louder this time. Daniel whispered sharply, "Jason, get down. Stay with Ethan." The teenager slid off his chair and crouched by the bed. Ranger padded forward, muscles taut, teeth barely bared, waiting for Daniel's signal. Daniel took a breath, steadying himself. "Who is it?" Silence. Then a voice. Male. Calm. Too calm. "Evening, Officer Hayes. We should talk." Every nerve in Daniel's body went taut. The voice didn't belong to Ortega or Ward or any deputy he trusted. It had an edge, like sandpaper across steel. He moved to the window, parted the curtain a sliver. A man stood beneath the flickering neon, his face shadowed by the brim of a ball cap. He wasn't in uniform. His stance wasn't neighborly. Behind him, a dark sedan idled with its headlights off. Another figure sat in the passenger seat, barely visible. Daniel's instincts screamed. This wasn't Law. He spoke through the door, voice level. "You have business with me. You go through the sheriff's office." The man chuckled softly. "Some things don't fit on paperwork. Open the door. No one needs to get hurt." Jason whispered behind him, voice breaking. "That's them. Mom's people." The knock turned into a shove, the thin motel door straining against its frame. Ranger barked once, explosive, filling the room with sound. Ethan cried out, scrambling up, eyes wide with terror. Daniel moved fast, pulling the boy against him. "Jason, in the bathroom now!" Jason hesitated, torn between fear and shame. Daniel's voice snapped, harsher this time. "Now!" Jason grabbed Ethan's arm and pulled him toward the bathroom. Ranger followed, positioning himself between them and the door as Daniel turned the lock. Another slam rattled the frame. Voices outside now, 2, maybe 3. Daniel's hand tightened on his weapon. He could feel the old line inside him, the one between badge and fatherhood dissolving. Tonight, they were the same thing. The door burst inward an inch, splintering wood around the lock. Daniel drew, his stance precise, voice sharp as a blade. "Law enforcement, back away from the door." Silence. Then the voice again, mocking. "Funny thing, law enforcement, you wear that badge, but tonight you're just a man with a kid in a mutt. Hand over the notebook and we walk away." Notebook. Jason's notebook. Daniel's heart pounded. They didn't want Ethan. Not directly. They wanted the record of Brenda's secrets, the vouchers, the dates, the proof of her debts. He called back. "You're trespassing and threatening minors. Last warning. Step away." The sedan's engine revved once, then cut off. Heavy footsteps retreated. For a heartbeat, Daniel thought they might leave. Then, glass shattered. A rock hurled through the side window, scattering shards across the motel floor. Ranger lunged, snarling, barking furiously. Daniel dropped low, weapon trained, his pulse hammering. The dark outside hid movement, but he could feel eyes watching through the break. Ethan whimpered from behind the bathroom door. Jason hissed, "They're not gonna stop." And then sirens. Distant at first, then swelling fast. Red and blue lights flickered against the curtains. Tires screeched. Doors slammed. "Sheriff's Department." A familiar voice boomed. "Ortega." The figures outside cursed, footsteps pounding gravel, the sedan roaring to life. The car fishtailed as it tore out of the lot, headlights snapping on too late. Deputies shouted, engines revved in pursuit. Daniel stayed frozen until Ortega's knock shook the broken door frame. "Danny, it's me." He lowered his weapon, unlocked the bathroom. Ethan flew into his arms, trembling, stone still in his grip. Ranger pressed against his leg, vibrating with energy. Jason emerged last, pale and shaken, clutching the notebook to his chest as if it were armor. Inside the ruined room, Ortega's eyes swept the damage. "You all right?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "For now." "Whoever they were," Ortega said grimly, "they wanted something bad enough to risk hitting a cop's room. That tells me this isn't just about Brenda anymore." Jason swallowed, voice hoarse. "They want what's in here." He lifted the notebook, trembling. "She told me if it ever got out, we'd all pay." Ortega's eyes darkened. "Then, that book doesn't leave my sight until it's locked in evidence." Daniel nodded, but unease gnawed at him. If Brenda's debts reached beyond this dusty town, if her secrets involved more than vouchers and discipline, then Ethan wasn't safe just because a judge signed a paper. Safety was a moving target. Jason's lips trembled as the motel room held its breath. Ortega's radio crackled in the background, deputies reporting the sedan's direction down the highway. Ranger remained at the window, body taut, as if waiting for shadows to move again. The boy whispered a single name. "Sheriff Larkin." Daniel froze. The air seemed to drop 10 degrees. His mind replayed every conversation, every late-night strategy meeting, every moment he had trusted the man who ran law enforcement in Red Rock. Ortega stiffened, disbelief flashing across his face. "Careful, kid. That's a heavy accusation." Jason shook his head quickly, desperate. "I heard her say it. Mom, she said she wasn't scared of cops 'cause Larkin owed her big, that he'd make sure nothing stuck, no matter what." Daniel's stomach twisted. Memory cut in sharp flashes. 3 red-lined CPS reports, all dismissed. Cases that never seemed to get traction. Brenda's smugness in the courtroom before the tide finally turned. Could Larkin have buried them? Ethan stirred on the bed, his small hand still clutching the white stone. "Dad?" His voice was hoarse. "What's happening?" Daniel crouched, brushing his son's hair back. "Nothing you need to worry about tonight, buddy. Ranger and I, we got you." But his own voice carried strain, like a rope pulled tight to the breaking point. Jason leaned forward, pale. "You gotta believe me. I didn't make it up. I was there when she talked to him. Not face to face, but on the phone. He came by after, brought her envelopes, said it was to keep the lights on." Ortega cursed softly in Spanish, rubbing his jaw. "If that's true, this town's sicker than we thought." Daniel met his deputy's eyes. "If we're chasing ghosts, fine. But if the sheriff's compromised, we're standing on rotten ground." The night stretched long. Deputies secured the lot, but the broken window let in the desert chill. Daniel barely slept, his mind turning over Jason's words like jagged glass. By morning, the motel smelled of stale coffee and adrenaline. Ortega returned with an update. The car ditched south of town. No plates. Torched. Whoever they are, they knew how to cover tracks. He hesitated. "And the sheriff? He wants a briefing. Says he'll meet you at the substation at noon." Daniel's pulse thudded. A test. Jason swallowed hard. "Don't go. If you do, he'll make sure the notebook disappears. He'll make sure we disappear." Ethan pressed closer against Daniel's side, silent but listening. The boy's wide eyes cut deeper than any warning. At the substation later, the desert sun glared off the windows, hiding faces inside. Daniel parked with caution, leaving Ethan and Jason under Ortega's protection at the motel. Ranger paced in the back seat, restless, sensing his handler's unease. Sheriff Larkin greeted him in the office. Mid-50 seconds, broad frame gone soft, gray hair slicked back, a smile practiced to look paternal. His handshake was firm, his gaze too direct. "Heard you had some trouble last night, Danny," he said smoothly. "Break in at the motel, I'm told? You and the boy all right?" Daniel studied him. Every syllable, every gesture. Larkin's concern looked real. But hadn't Brenda worn that same masked confidence that the system would shield her? "Someone wanted Jason's notebook," Daniel said carefully. "You know what that means." Larkin's eyes flickered just briefly, almost imperceptible. "Notebook? Teenagers write all kinds of stories. Don't hang your hat on scribbles." Daniel's chest tightened. The sheriff knew too much too quickly. When Daniel returned to the motel, Ortega was pacing outside, arms folded. Jason sat on the curb, notebook hugged to his chest. Ethan leaned against Ranger, head resting on the dog's back. "How'd it go?" Ortega asked. Daniel exhaled. He knew about the notebook, and I didn't tell him. Jason's face drained of color. "I told you." Daniel crouched, steadying the boy with a firm hand on his shoulder. "I'm listening, but if we move on this, we do it smart. One wrong step, and the whole house falls." Jason's eyes glistened. "I don't want it to fall on Ethan." Neither did Daniel. That evening, as the sun sank behind the ridges, Daniel sat at the small motel desk, staring at the notebook Jason had given him. Page after page of scribbles, dates, and half-legible confessions of a household unraveling. At first glance, just the scrawls of a scared teen. But between them, patterns. Notes about phone calls at odd hours, cash in envelopes, references to the deal. He marked one entry with his finger. March 14. Sheriff came by again. Mom said he'd keep the case closed, said we're safe. Daniel's pulse pounded. Behind him, Ethan stirred, muttering in his sleep, stone still in hand. Ranger nudged the boy with his nose, settling him again. Jason dozed in a chair, head tilted back, exhaustion softening his features. Daniel whispered into the dim room, almost to himself. "If the sheriff's dirty, this isn't just about custody, it's about survival." The motel was quiet again by morning, but the quiet felt wrong, too thin, too deliberate, like silence waiting to break. Daniel sat at the small table, the battered notebook open before him, coffee cooling untouched at his elbow. Jason dozed in a chair, twitching fitfully, his arms wrapped tight around himself. Ethan still slept curled against Ranger's flank, one hand gripping the white stone, as though his small palm was the only thing keeping the world intact. Daniel's phone lay on the table, the words from the midnight call echoing in his mind. Burn the notebook. It wasn't just a threat. It was an order. And orders meant someone believed they still had control. By noon, Ortega returned, his jaw tight, eyes shadowed from too many sleepless hours. He closed the door behind him, lowering his voice. I checked with dispatch. Sheriff Larkin never logged half the calls you made during the rescue. No record of your first request for CPS backup. No record of the juvenile distress call. It's like those calls vanished. Daniel's stomach twisted. And Brenda's people knew about Jason's notebook before anyone else did. They knew fast. Jason looked up, fear flickering across his face. You think he's feeding them? Ortega hesitated, then nodded. I think your sheriff's running cover for more than just Brenda. And I think this notebook is the only thing that can prove it. Daniel glanced at Ethan, who had just stirred awake. His boy rubbed his eyes, clutching the stone tighter, as if sensing the tension in the room. Dad, Ethan whispered, are we safe? Daniel knelt, pressing his hand to his son's cheek. Not yet, but we will be, I promise. Promises were dangerous in law enforcement. But this one he would die before breaking. That night, the danger came back. It started with the smell of smoke. Ranger lifted his head first, nostrils flaring, a low growl resonating in his chest. Daniel caught it a second later, the acrid bite of burning wood, faint but growing. He yanked the blinds back. Flames licked at the edge of the motel's dumpster out front, orange sparks carried by the desert wind toward the row of rooms. An arson warning, a message. Ortega was already on his radio, calling for fire units. Jason scrambled back, panic in his voice. They're serious. They're not going to stop until it's gone. Daniel's jaw tightened. He looked at the notebook on the table. He looked at his son clutching the stone. Then he looked at Jason, torn between guilt and desperation. We can't keep running room to room, Daniel said. We need daylight, witnesses, protection that can't be erased. Ortega's eyes narrowed. You're thinking court. Daniel nodded. Public, recorded. Somewhere Sheriff Larkin can't bury it. The next morning, Judge Whitaker's courtroom filled faster than it had for the custody hearing. Word of the motel incident spread through Red Rock like wildfire, pulling townsfolk to the benches. Farmers in sun-faded caps, mothers clutching children's hands, old neighbors who had seen too much silence. Whitaker took the bench, her gavel sharp. We are here on emergency motion to review new evidence tied to the Vaughn case. Officer Hayes, proceed. Daniel stood, notebook in hand, his voice steady, though his pulse hammered. Your Honor, this is not just about custody. This is about a system compromised. This notebook, kept by Jason Vaughn, contains records of neglect, confinement, and direct references to protection promised by Sheriff Larkin. Last night, unknown individuals attempted to seize it. When they failed, they tried to burn us out. A ripple moved through the gallery. Whitaker's eyes sharpened. Do you have corroboration? Ortega stepped forward, his deputy's badge gleaming. Yes, Your Honor. Missing dispatch records, calls erased, evidence tampered. That doesn't happen by accident. Klein, Brenda's defense lawyer, jumped up, shouting. This is circumstantial. Whitaker silenced him with one glare. Sit down. She gestured to Jason. Young man, approach. Jason walked stiffly to the stand, clutching the notebook. His voice shook, but his words carried. I wrote it all down, 'cause I was scared. Scared for Ethan. Scared of my mom. Scared nobody would believe me. She said the sheriff would cover for her. Said nothing would ever stick. But I couldn't watch anymore. He lifted his chin, pale but determined. I'm not lying. For the first time, the gallery was utterly silent. Whitaker leaned back, weighing the words. This notebook will be entered into the record. An independent investigation will proceed immediately. Sheriff Larkin is hereby suspended from duty pending inquiry. Effective now. The gavel struck. Daniel exhaled slowly, a knot loosening in his chest. Ethan reached for his hand, whispering, We did it, Dad. But even in victory, Daniel felt the warning. The enemies outside weren't finished. They had already tried the dark road, the motel window, the fire. They would try again. Resolution divided by transition. End of chapter 8. As the courtroom emptied, Daniel guided Ethan toward the door, Ranger pacing close. Jason followed, the notebook clutched under Ortega's watch. On the courthouse steps, the desert wind picked up, carrying the faintest trace of smoke still lingering from the night before. Ethan tugged at his father's sleeve. Dad, he whispered, holding up the white stone. It feels hot, like it knows. Daniel frowned, touching the smooth surface. It was warm, warmer than it should have been after hours in his son's palm. He glanced across the street. A dark SUV idled at the curb, windows tinted, engine low, too familiar, too patient. And then the passenger window rolled down just enough to reveal a pair of eyes watching, cold, calculating. The SUV pulled away, slow, deliberate. Daniel tightened his arm around Ethan. The court had ruled, the sheriff had fallen, but the war for Red Rock wasn't finished. The story of Daniel, Ethan, Jason, and Ranger is more than a dramatic account of survival, betrayal, and justice. It is a mirror held up to the core values we all wrestle with in daily life. At its heart, the narrative reminds us that the bond between parent and child is unbreakable, even when systems fail, and even when fear tries to silence truth. Daniel's fight for Ethan is not simply about custody. It is about the sacred duty of protection, the courage to stand against corruption, and the unyielding promise that love must always outweigh fear. The presence of Ranger, the loyal German shepherd, amplifies this truth. Animals in our lives often embody what humans forget: unconditional loyalty, instinctive protection, and the ability to steady our hearts when everything else trembles. Ranger becomes both shield and healer, a reminder that trust can be rebuilt not only through words but through presence and consistency. Jason's journey offers another lesson. Children shaped by trauma are not destined to repeat it. Given a chance and shown a path, even a boy raised in shadows can choose the light. His notebook, raw, imperfect, but brave, teaches us that speaking the truth, no matter how fragile, can shift the course of lives. The white stone Ethan clutches symbolizes something deeply universal, the small anchors of hope we all cling to in darkness. For some, it is faith. For others, family. For many, it is simply the memory that love once showed up. In a world often clouded by betrayal, silence, and corruption, the story insists that courage, compassion, and community still matter. It challenges us to notice the quiet cries around us, to act when others turn away, and to believe that healing is not only possible, it is necessary for generations to come.